Hey, thanks for being back at the Faculty Factory podcast. I'm Kim Skorupski here at Hopkins, looking at another frequent flyer on the podcast, Dr. Bill Mallon. Folks, Dr. Mallon was here, episode number 221. It was something we'd never done before on the podcast. We talked about climate action. Bill had co-authored a report called Climate Action in Academic Medicine. It was super cool. You can download it as a PDF on the website, facultyfactory.org. And so that was really interesting. But in the interim, Dr. Mallon and a co-author, Natalia Cox, have been working really hard and published this awesome article in Academic Medicine. It came out in March, and it's entitled Promotion and Tenure Policies and Practices at U.S. Medical Schools. Is tenure irrelevant or more relevant than ever? This is a really important paper. Bill has a lot of really not only good information about how the study was conducted and what they found in terms of trends at the, say, the macro level, but then also at the individual faculty level. But there's some really interesting philosophical questions that Bill wants to get into. So I can't wait for him to share this with you. Thanks again, Bill, for being on the podcast. And tell us about this paper.
Yeah, thanks, Kim, for having me. It's great to be back with you and with all your listeners, many of whom I have a feeling probably contributed to this paper by in their roles as folks who work in faculty affairs at U.S. medical schools. And of course, we rely on these folks to share their data with us so that we can compile it and synthesize it and put it into a paper like this. So we really appreciate that.
Okay, hey, Bill, let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you because I forgot to introduce you. And you're saying we is the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges. Dr. Bill Mallon, EDD, is the Senior Director of Strategy and Innovation Development at the AAMC. So I want to make sure people know who is the we and where you're from. So we love the AAMC and all the work you're doing there. So go ahead. Sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah, no, thanks. And my I guess my current title somewhat belies the relationship I have to this topic. I came to the AAMC many years ago now, specifically with an interest on faculty work life. In fact, I did my dissertation on academic tenure. So wow. I've been around this topic and around this space for a long time, and it's kind of my first love, if you will. So the AAMC had not published a study on promotion and tenure policies in 10 years. So we really were past due. This is an update really to work that the AAMC did quite consistently over time about these policy provisions and these trends in faculty work life. And so we were really happy to get the paper in Academic Medicine for an update on all of that. And I'd be happy to share some of the highlights, Kim, if you'd like me to.
Yeah, of course. I'm looking at the abstract here and reminding myself 2022, 118 medical schools, 37 other medical schools. I'm just reading for you, but yeah, please do tell us the high level takeaway points, and then I want to get into the really meaty discussion.
Yeah. So the study included all accredited U.S. medical schools, MD granting medical schools, a large majority of them that completed a very detailed survey. And for those that didn't, we actually found their policy provisions through faculty handbooks and other information they have online. So at the time of the study, we included 100% of medical schools in the study. So we have really good data.
Yeah.
And also, thanks to my colleagues at the AAMC who operate the AAMC faculty roster, which is a compilation of all U.S. full-time medical faculty in the U.S., we have really good data there too. So it's a compilation of some strong indicators of where the industry, where the academic medicine community is going.
Perfect.
So to start at the top, the thing that I usually want to talk about first is just a reminder for people about what tenure is, and how it's used in higher education broadly before we get into medical schools. So just as a reminder, tenure is an indefinite appointment that can only be terminated for cause or under extraordinary circumstances. People sometimes call it a lifetime guarantee. It's not, but it does have very, defined policy provisions about when an appointment can be terminated. And the other thing to keep in mind when we talk about all of these data is we're talking about full-time faculty. So we did not include part-time faculty in any of the study components.
Yeah.
And when we look at all 4-year colleges in the U.S., one of the things to keep in mind about tenure for higher education in general is that it is the normative faculty employment system in U.S. 4-year colleges and universities. Almost 90% of 4-year institutions have a tenure system. What's interesting is that the percentage of faculty who have tenure or are on a tenure track has been declining. So the most recent statistics from the U.S. Department of Ed, 58% of full-time faculty at all 4-year colleges and universities were tenured or on a tenure track. That compares to 71% 10 years ago. So there's a decline. And when we look at medical schools, it's comparable. So when we talk about tenure as a system of faculty employment, most U.S. medical schools have a tenure system, 90%, in fact. 5% of them only offer tenure to basic science faculty. But even if we remove those institutions, 85% of U.S. medical schools have a fully traditional system of tenure for at least some portion of their faculty.
Okay.
And I want to talk about how that kind of plays out at an individual faculty level, because having a tenure system doesn't mean that the institution uses it. But before we jump to that, the other thing that I think has been really interesting is when we look at differences between schools recently accredited, those who have that have been recently founded, compared to those that we might call legacy schools. I don't mean that in any kind of pejorative sense. It's just that those that have been around longer. So just as a reminder, there were 124 medical schools in the U.S. that were accredited prior to 1983. Oh. And for those 124, I'm just going to refer to them as legacy schools. And then there was a 20-year gap from 1983 to 2002 that no new medical schools were created at all. And since 2002, there have been 32 new medical schools. So if we look at those accredited since 2002, 47% of them, almost half, have a non-traditional system of faculty employment, meaning they either have no tenure system at all or they only offer it for basic science faculty.
Wow.
So 47%, that compares to 7% for legacy schools that have a non-traditional system. Wow. So for these schools that have been started in the last 20 years, they, for a number of reasons, they have set up systems for their faculty whereby they are not either not offering tenure at all, or they're offering it only in limited circumstances.
Hey, Bill, I don't want to take you off track too much, so tell me if you want to cover this later, but why? So if, the whole thing of innovation, if we're seeing half of new schools saying, nah, we're going to do something different here, walk us through not that necessarily, but what do you assume are the reasons for that? Or if you want to cover it later, let's cover it later. I don't want to take you off talk.
No. It's a great question. Well, let's talk about it right now. Okay. There's a number of reasons why newer schools have limited or no tenure systems. Some of them are particular to the structure or organization of the institution itself. So, for example, one new medical school is part of a university that has a highly restrictive tenure system. So when that university started that medical school, it was not surprising at all that they don't offer tenure, because the entire university really doesn't do that. There's a few new medical schools that are part of existing health systems. They have no tie to a single parent university. So if you're a health system and you're starting a standalone medical school, it's highly unlikely you're going to create a system of tenure, right? Because there's not that close relationship to the parent university where tenure is already established as the norm. So in those cases, they don't really emanate from the dominant academic culture and traditions of a research university. And so therefore, maybe it's not surprising that they don't. There's a few other new schools that started with a different faculty employment model than the normative one. And what I mean there is there's a number of new medical schools that are community-based. So they don't own or control the clinical enterprise. They don't employ full-time faculty to start. And they only have a very small cadre of basic science faculty. And those basic science faculty are not like the basic science faculty at Hopkins. They are not R01 funded biomedical research faculty. They are really focused on delivering the medical education curriculum. And so I'm aware of at least two rationales for limiting tenure in those circumstances. First is that the school decided from a policy standpoint that instituting a tenure system for a small number of faculty, say in some cases fewer than 20, it was just too administratively complex to create a tenure system for 20 faculty.
Right.
And then the second rationale was that they operate in a university system that is still quite traditional in how it awards tenure. In other words, there's much more of an emphasis on traditional research, and faculty who are more educational focused have a much harder time substantiating their scholarship because they operate in a model that doesn't embrace the Boyer model, right? And so in those cases, the folks who started the medical school said, we don't want to set up our faculty for failure because we know we're hiring them to be education focused, and they will not succeed in this dominant model under which we're operating, meaning the university. So in those cases, in a few cases I'm aware of, they just said, look, we're going to set up a system of that our basic science teaching faculty will all be non-tenure track, because we're just not going to try to upend the dominant model that our university operates under. So there's a number of reasons. So it's really hard to peg just one, but those are some.
Oh God, that's wonderful. So from the faculty members' perspective, I'll say the new generation or the up and comers, the early career faculty members, do they care? Do they, first of all, do they even know about tenure? Is that in their calculus of where they're choosing to work? And if they don't, does it matter? Basically, like so what? Do the new faculty members these days go, I don't care, it doesn't matter to me, it makes no difference to me whatsoever? And should there be but maybe it should? Are we stripping some power, some security? Are we removing some kind of a safety net from those faculty members?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
No. And Kim, that's a great question. I don't know that I would necessarily differentiate it between younger faculty and mid-career and more established or senior faculty, right? I think what you're getting at is a fundamental question that will apply to any faculty member at any stage in their career. And it is this. And it's in fact the question that we pose in the title of the paper. Is it relevant? Or is it irrelevant or more relevant than ever? I think it would be fair to say that for a large number of full-time clinical faculty who spend all of their time in the delivery of patient care and have very, very limited or no academic component to what they do, that academic tenure is not something that they aspire to.
Right.
It just doesn't it doesn't manifest itself as a need for someone who's got that particular career focus, right? And even if we look at the symbolic reasons of why tenure is important, never mind the substantive ones about academic freedom and job security. But if you look at the symbolic reasons, one of the reasons it still is so important to faculty in other divisions of the university, it is because it is the coin of the realm. It signifies that faculty member has achieved something and has a level of stature in their academic community and in their broader community, right? And I would posit, and would love to hear from others if they disagree, that physicians in our society already have that stature by nature of having an MD degree, right?
Right.
So, I hear from a lot of them, well, tenure doesn't get me anything because I already have that stature in my academic community and in my broader community. So for many faculty in medical schools or in academic medicine, the symbolic importance of having a tenured faculty appointment doesn't resonate as much, not to say it doesn't resonate at all, but does not resonate as much as, say, if we were talking to a philosophy professor or a history professor or an English professor.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. I definitely, if you look at the society as a whole, I bet you 99.9% of humanity has no idea what tenure means. People who don't work in academia, they have no idea what that means. And you talk to people who are in academia, and many of them like, I don't know what that means. I'll tell you what it does mean to some of our faculty members here at Hopkins is that means, if I get promoted and if I think I'm going to get some kind of a little bump in my salary, it's only going to be because it's on my back. I have to work harder to get that money. It's not as going to be like a gift given to me. I'm basically working a lot harder, the equivalent of essentially a part-time job, to get your portfolio together and to go through the gauntlet of getting promoted, and then you get the title, but you may not get the extra money. And if you do, it's going to be through with your own sweat. So there's kind of a lot of careerism, what matters. And then you add the other complexity of our expanding footprints and getting and acquiring other hospitals and systems where those employees, those providers say, oh, so now I'm a Hopkins employee. Well, I want to be a professor as well. And so then you have all these kind of disparities of, wait a minute, they're also professors now and they make double and triple the salary we make. What's going on here? So it's a lot of it's kind of like this. It's a big mishmash.
Yeah, you're raising an even broader question that we don't examine in the paper, but I know that you've had some guests on the past and talking about like what is even the definition of a faculty member in academic medicine, right? And that is an important topic that we as a community will need to continue to wrestle with. And yeah, the thing that I like to keep in mind is that there are multiple models and multiple pathways, and many medical schools, and Hopkins may be one of them, have well differentiated faculty tracks, recognizing that faculty members across the board have different interests and different focus areas, and that there should be sustainable career pathways for all of them. And for some of them, that will be a tenure track, and that is important. And it is far more than getting more work, right? What that means is more substantial and more important than just that. But for other faculty members, a tenure track is not something that's of interest. They want to have a career pathway that leads them to do it at a different place, and that's fine too. I think more broadly for me, is a question, and I can share a little bit about where the trend lines are going.
Oh,
But
please.
for me, the question that I worry about is if tenure were to erode so substantially that it simply doesn't exist. And there I ask the question, what would be lost if nobody had a tenured appointment? And we could ask the question, would anything be lost, particularly on the clinical faculty side? If we look at new hires, in other words, faculty members who were hired in the previous year, for clinical faculty members, full-time clinical faculty members, only 10% of them are now hired into a tenure track appointment. That is a huge downward trend in the last 40 years. In 1982, it was more than 50% who were tenured or on a tenure track for new hired faculty, and now it's only 1 in 10. So what would be lost if it went from 1 in 10 to 0 in 10? Would anything? And I think it's probably reasonable that if we had 100 faculty members on the line with us right now, that many of them would say, nah, nothing, it's not important to me. But we know that some of our clinical faculty members and some of our basic science faculty members are doing research and teaching the next generation of physicians and scientists on important, critical, and highly controversial issues. Let's name a few: reproductive care, gender-affirming care, vaccine research, DEI, climate change, health equity. These are hot button topics that we see every day in the paper being under threat. And what if nobody has the protections of academic freedom? We need our faculty to be speaking out on these issues. We need our faculty to be doing research on these issues and to feel that they can be in the classroom teaching our future physicians what they need to know to take care of vulnerable populations. And what if nobody feels like they have the academic freedom to teach and to do research? And that's one of the things that tenure affords, right? The protection of academic freedom. And I have never heard anyone give a good policy alternative. If it's not tenure that protects academic freedom, what does? Mm-hmm. And that's, to me, the critical thing. Like, I fully understand that for many faculty members, that's not what they do. And so that doesn't really enter their lives. But for some of them, when it matters greatly. And I think that's what we all as a community need to wrestle with a little bit. Tenure, I think, has been eroding under the radar. I don't think there's anyone from like a national perspective that set out to say, let's get rid of tenure slowly over the last 40, right? It's just as it's what's happened. But now we're at a point where maybe we collectively need to look at these trends and say, is that okay? Do we need some new career pathways where, in fact, we are ensuring that faculty who would benefit from the protections of academic freedom, in fact, enjoy them, that they work hard and then they earn that right of tenure, so that they benefit from the protections that it affords. That's the issue for me.
Absolutely, 100%. Tell us about what you found in the paper, differences with men, women, our underrepresented in medicine faculty colleagues. What are you, kind of high level? What are you seeing there with trends?
Yeah, sure. So, and actually, let me maybe I should just take a step back, and for your listeners who haven't read the paper yet, and I know they all will, I'll kind of talk about the overall
academic
trend.
medicine, March.
Yes. Thank you. So let's just talk about kind of overall trends, and then we'll talk about the differences between some of the differences that we've seen. So the headline is that for basic science faculty, PhD basic science faculty, the percentage of faculty who are tenured or on track has declined over time, it's gone down a little bit. It used to be almost 8 out of 10 faculty who were tenured or on track, and now it's 64% according to the most recent data. So there's been a slow erosion there. That's been driven by the tenure status of new hires. So about 10 years ago, for the entire academic medicine community, more basic science faculty were started to be hired into non-tenured track lines than tenured track lines. And so presumably we can anticipate over time those percentages will continue to decline because more and more faculty in basic science departments are being hired on non-tenured track lines.
Yep. So
that's the headline on the basic science faculty side. I alluded to the headline on the clinical side, and it's this: 72% of clinical faculty, clinical full-time MD clinical faculty are on a non-tenured track. Only 18% are on a tenured or tenure track line, and that is driven by new hires. And I mentioned that earlier, only 10% of new hires for MD clinical faculty are on that tenured or tenure track line. So that's the trend line overall. What we see with some of the differences in men and women and faculty from minoritized communities is this. The data on the prevalence of tenure for men versus women, it differs a little bit when we look at basic science or clinical departments. For basic science faculty, there has been a persistent negative gap in the percentages of women faculty who are tenured or on track compared to men. The gap has been between 12 to 15% year over year for 4 decades. And this is continued despite a lot of programmatic efforts and recruitment efforts and training and the development efforts, both at the national and local levels, right? Like this has been a problem that people have been trying to address for literally 40 years, and yet nothing is changing. So that's with the basic science side. For clinical faculty, there is still a gap. It is narrowing. It used to be a difference between 10 to 12 percentage points, the difference between men and women who are tenured or on track. In recent years, it's narrowed to 5%. But don't get excited, because that narrowing is not because schools are increasing the percentage of women clinical faculty members, but because the percentage of men have declined at a faster rate. So in other words, it's more like a race toward the bottom. So that's men versus women. If we look at the percentages of tenured and tenure track faculty by race and ethnicity, for basic science faculty, it's a similar story than what we just discussed with men versus women. That faculty who identify as being from minoritized communities, Black and African American, Hispanic, Asian, compared to white faculty, have there's a consistent negative gap. And it has remained that way, again, for 40 years. For clinical faculty, similar story to what we see with women, that it's a race toward the bottom, that the tenure gap has narrowed over time, but only because it's declined so precipitously for all groups. So, if you read the literature on tenure, many people argue that tenure perpetuates inequities for faculty from minoritized groups. In other words, that tenure is in and of itself an example of systemic racism in the academy. And the data that I just referenced, as well as the data that we see on gender inequities, I think lend the support that we have a systemic problem. What I would say is, I'm not sure it's tenure per se. I think it's any type of system of faculty appointment and evaluation that has these built-in inequities. In other words, if we got rid of tenure, guess what? I think we'd still have some inequities in how we evaluate faculty because of all of the research that we know on unconscious bias in the evaluation process, right? That we simply have a lot more work to do in this space.
All right. Do we know if there's any difference in ownership status of these schools, private versus public? Because I'm trying to put my hat on as leaders of institutions, what's in their best interest. So your arguments are so well articulated that the essence of academic freedom is what defines the academy. And even if you don't buy into that or do that as a practitioner and providing care, you will be the recipient. You'll be on the receiving end of some of the people who are doing that research, or if your patients who are leery about vaccines or curious about gender affirming care or questions about reproductive health. Even if you're not in that space, your patients are to some degree in that space. So what does the ownership status have to do with these decisions to either start medical schools without a tenure system, or consume other, expand the footprint and buy other hospitals and choose not to have that tenure system go out to those tendrils and out away from the mothership, or maybe the decisions to make it harder to get tenure? I'm trying to understand from the other side of this scene here. What is it by the owners and the leaders to not do this? Because wearing my dean hat, we're at Hopkins, we are revising our silver book, what's called it's the accompany book to the gold book. And the gold book is like the Bible for faculty here at Hopkins on the policies, regulations, and the mutual goodwill between leadership and faculty. But I'm seeing, so we're revising this book. This is a 12-month long process of revising this whole silver book, the how to get promoted, because 4 or 5 years ago, we recently added a second promotion path. It used to be just traditional, the research track, and now we have a clinical excellence track, and we're talking about putting an educator excellence track. But it's a lot of work, as you implied earlier. Getting people promoted, the whole promotion machine is a ton of money. I'd love to see someone analyze how much money in terms of hours it costs for faculty to get their materials ready, for the letter writers to write the letters, for the committees to meet and the decisions and the trustees all the way up through the gamuts. It's a lot of money and time. So that return on investment, I'm trying to understand both ends of this tenure system. I know I've just talked a lot here and thrown a lot at you, but help me out, Bill.
Yeah. So let me, excuse me. Let me see if I can address a couple of those things, at least in part, and then you can follow up. I don't think there are any meaningful differences between private and public institutions in terms of offering a tenure system or not.
Okay.
There might be slight differences, but I don't think they're meaningful. In other words, public institutions and private institutions are just as likely to have a traditional faculty employment model as across the board. State institutions, particularly those new medical schools that were created under the auspice of an existing state institution, there are some examples of newer institutions, newer medical schools having a tenure system, but there are also examples of newer state-supported medical schools not having a tenure system. So I think it's kind of hard to make that differentiation there. And in fact, I don't personally think that that's the meaningful difference. I think where there are some differences between public and private institutions in our current environment is there are definitely more public institutions that are under scrutiny from certain state legislatures and policymakers about what is being taught what is being the focus, what faculty members are focusing their research on, and whether or not faculty feel that their institution now has a culture where they can't speak out because of a state outlawing the teaching of quote unquote divisive concepts.
Right.
That I think is real. So their private institutions, or maybe I should say a higher percentage of private institutions, are not having those immediate direct attacks. Not to say at all that they aren't feeling them. I think all of higher education and all of medical education is feeling that to some degree. So that's where I think there's a significant difference there.
Yeah, thanks for helping me clarify my thoughts. That's exactly where I was going with. I'm trying to consider the pressures on leaders in academic institutions if they're in a state-supported system where governments and elected officials can determine what is taught, what is researched, what is funded, what is not funded, what offices should be closed or opened. That, it seems to me, would have incredible pressure. And even with private institutions, we have boards of trustees, and similarly, where they have funders and donors and philanthropy and divestments and all these interests that can be that are pressured and moved and shifted like anybody's priorities. I guess it's, maybe I'm overthinking this, but I guess like the NIH has funding priorities. I imagine that they're, depending on who's in power, who's in control, they're going to have different priorities. So that to me gets to your fundamental question, Bill, of tenure and the relevance of it and academic freedom, right? That's the bigger concern to me is
right. Yeah.
It can be a little big brothery worrying about if we get rid of that, then are we just sitting around and we are minions being told what thou shalt research and what care thou shalt provide or not provide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of us in this community have to wrestle with that in our current environment. I mean, it's a scary time. Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. While there are perhaps more overt and legislated mandates being handed down from states, that in no way suggests that private institutions don't have their own pressures that they feel, and from donors and trustees. And we only need to look at what happened to the president of Harvard University recently as an example of that, right?
No.
So yeah, and the thing that I think about and don't have a great answer for myself, but if the majority of faculty in U.S. higher education and at U.S. medical schools don't have tenure, and they don't, what policy provisions protect those individuals from their classroom teaching, their research, their ability to speak out on matters of importance to society? Now, all of us, of course, have the benefit of First Amendment rights. So I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about if you go back to the fundamental underpinnings of why tenure was put into place to begin with. So go back and read the AAUP's 1915 statement or their 1940 statement. They talk about those policies talk about the need for faculty members to have academic freedom in three domains: in their teaching, in their research, and in their extramural activities. And if the majority of faculty don't have those protections from tenure, then is there anything from a policy perspective that can afford them the same protections?
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know what that answer is. That there are some institutions, both in medical schools and in 4-year universities, that offer multi-year contracts
I was just going to ask contracts. Yeah.
right, as a alternative to tenure. And some of them are actually like multi years, like 10-year contracts. And you could, I suppose, argue that if someone's on a 10-year contract, that in year 1, 2, and 3, maybe they will have enough of a runway where they feel protected in being able to speak out. But then I have to ask, well, what about years 8, 9, and 10?
Yeah.
So what happens? Like, do they then become more cautious and more reticent? And I don't know, maybe there's some creative ways to think about that. Like maybe there's an automatic renewal at year 7, provided that they, have a strong record of scholarship and teaching and service that would it would be kind of like a rolling long-term contract. Maybe that would kind of address some of that. I don't know. Like, I think we can maybe think creatively about alternatives, but the fundamental question for me still stands, which is, what are we, and I mean we as a broad community of scholars and a broad community of academics, doing to protect one of the fundamental underpinnings that has contributed to U.S. higher education and U.S. medical education being so strong and envied around the world. And I think we need to wrestle with that.
Well, that makes me think, Bill, you're the expert here. What do other countries do? Do we have any other best practices in other countries? I know nothing about tenure anywhere else. Does it even exist?
Yeah, so this is definitely not my area of expertise either. But I was giving a talk at one of our medical schools recently, and there was a couple of faculty members who were from a number of different countries, and the takeaway I learned from them is that there is no system of tenure, and I don't want to speak universally across the board, but it, at least for some of the examples they gave me, that it definitely is not the same type of system as it is in the U.S. But Kim, honestly, that's not my international comparison is not my area, so I shouldn't say more than that.
Okay, I have no clue. So what's the next step, Bill? What is the next what's on your horizons in terms of this work, promotion and tenure work at the AAMC?
Yeah. Well, I won't speak for what's at the AAMC per se, but one of the things that I find really interesting, and I'm going to continue to monitor the trends. It goes back to the issue that you raised earlier about, from an individual faculty member's perspective, the choice when they're starting out to be on a tenured track versus a non-tenured track, and what we could do as a community to encourage more people to pursue that tenure track career pathway when it suits the person, right? And what I find really interesting is that there are a number of medical schools, not a lot, but there's a number of medical schools that have started offering a undeclared track. And my read on this is it's akin to like being an undeclared major as a freshman in college, right? So you start out and you actually don't know. And under a traditional system, you're either put on a tenured line or you're not, and then that's the line you're on, right? And what I hear from a number of our colleagues around the country is that if they're forced to choose right at the beginning of their appointment, the beginning of their career, particularly lots of clinical investigators will choose the non-tenure track line.
Right.
And if they had a little bit more time to set up their lab and set up their clinical practice and get started in a research career, whatever kind of research that may be, they may later choose, oh, actually, I can make this tenured track work for me. And then they choose that tenure track after 2 or 3 years. And that's when the tenure clock starts.
Right.
Right. So
Very,
I think that's really interesting and maybe worth exploring and talking more in kind of our broad community, because if part of what's driving the downward trend in tenure is faculty members' propensity to not feel like they would have the institutional support and career support and family support and other types of support to make that work, that if giving them those supports early on are then more likely to make them successful, then let's explore how we could do that better.
yeah.
And I raise that just for the very reasons that we've been talking about so much so far, is it I believe behooves the entire community to have a strong cadre of tenured faculty, both mid-career and senior, who can speak out and be forceful in representing the academic values that have made our community so strong over the decades. And we need that. We need that desperately now, as much as we always have. So I would love to see that we could sustain this career pathway and it just doesn't wither away on the vine.
Very well said. Oh, love the way you think, Bill. This has been a wonderful conversation with Dr. William T. Mallon, EDD. Please read his article in Academic Medicine in March, this past March 2024, entitled Promotion and Tenure Policies and Practices at U.S. Medical Schools. Is tenure irrelevant or more relevant than ever? The link will be on our website, facultyfactory.org. You can email Bill at wmallon, WMALLON, at AAMC.org. That email address will also be on the website. You are such a great guest. I love this work. Thank you so much for doing it. It's not easy. Thanks for leading us and thinking about these issues. I'm looking forward to a conversation in the future. I'm going to go dig up the AAUP 1915, 1940s articles, and read, try to understand this, but such important history. And we're so fortunate to have you on the podcast. Thanks, Bill. I'll let you say the last final words.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. It's always a great talking to you. Appreciate the conversation.
Hello, everyone. It's your podcast producer, Casey Calnan. Please make sure to download for free our newest Faculty Factory book, The Academic Medicine Starter Kit, Timeless Tips and Guidance for Early Career Faculty Members. More information on that is available on the facultyfactory.org homepage. In addition to that, I wanted to let you know that as of June 2024, this podcast has had more than 85,000 total downloads and roughly 11,000 total YouTube views. And in addition to that, the Faculty Factory website has drawn 46,000 web visits from users in 122 countries. And we're inviting you to be a guest on our show. Please reach out if you'd like to be a guest or to nominate someone in our academic medicine community that you think we need to hear from. Visit us on facultyfactory.org and drop us a message there.
Thanks for tuning in to Faculty Factory Podcast. The mission of the Faculty Factory is to build and support a community of leaders in faculty development who share tools, resources, wisdom, and encouragement in service to our faculty members, schools, and institutions. We encourage you to go to facultyfactory.org to find out more. Get in touch with me, ask me any questions. Maybe you want to be interviewed on the podcast. Thanks for tuning in to Faculty Factory Podcast. We'll see you next time. The Faculty Factory podcast and website is sponsored by the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine Office of Faculty. For more information, visit facultyfactory.org.